The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the ground shook under the weight of explosions. Jack moved quickly between broken walls, his rifle tight in his hands. The sky above was a dull gray, lit only by the flashes of gunfire and the bright streaks of artillery. This planet had been under attack for weeks, and now it was just a graveyard of steel and bodies. He turned a corner and froze. Standing a few meters ahead was a tall alien warrior in full armor. Her armor was battered, dented, and covered in dark stains that could only be blood. It was a deep red, smeared across her chest plate, her arms, and even splashed across her helmet. For a second, Jack thought she might be an enemy, but then he noticed the faint mark of the coalition painted on her shoulder. She was one of the good ones, at least for now. She looked at him with cold, sharp eyes, sizing him up. Jack, still catching his breath, let out a short laugh. "Nice paint job," he said, nodding at her armor. The alien didn't even blink. Her voice was calm, steady, almost casual when she replied, "Yeah, it's mostly enemy." Jack blinked in surprise. He had expected an insult, or maybe for her to ignore him entirely. Instead, she'd answered with a remark that made him realize this warrior wasn't just tough, she had a sharp tongue too. He grinned despite the chaos around them. Before they could speak further, a loud roar echoed from the street ahead. Enemy troops were pushing forward again. Jack ducked behind a pile of rubble, motioning for her to do the same. Without hesitation, she crouched beside him, moving with the smooth, silent skill of someone who had been fighting far longer than he had. "You've got a name?" Jack asked while reloading his rifle. "Lyra," she said shortly. "And you're human." Jack smirked. "Jack, and yeah, last I checked." They didn't get a chance to exchange more words. Enemy soldiers rounded the corner, their weapons, firing bursts of bright plasma. Jack and Lyra opened fire at the same time, their movements strangely in sync. She moved with precision, each shot finding its target, while Jack's style was more unpredictable. Quick bursts, sudden changes in position, and improvised use of the environment. In just a few minutes, the street went silent again, except for the distant thunder of battle elsewhere. Jack looked over at Lyra. "Guess we're both still alive," he said. "For now," she replied, standing and checking her ammo. As they moved forward, Jack noticed how she scanned every shadow, every rooftop, like she could feel danger before it appeared. Her armor was damaged in so many places, it looked like it had survived a dozen battles already. The blood on it wasn't fresh, it had dried in uneven streaks, but it still told a story. Jack couldn't help but wonder how many enemies she had fought to get it looking like that. They reached a half-destroyed building and took cover inside. The roof had collapsed, leaving them exposed to the gray sky, but it was better than standing in the open street. Jack leaned against a wall, catching his breath again. "So," he said, "how many of them did you have to cut through for that? Paint job?" Lyra gave him a side glance. "Enough to keep me alive. More than I want to count." Her tone was simple, but there was something heavy behind her words. Jack didn't push for details. He could tell she was the kind of person who carried her history silently. A sudden transmission crackled in Jack's earpiece. His commander's voice came through, telling him to move to the forward line and link up with the coalition unit holding Sector 7. Lyra seemed to get the same order through her own comms. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Looks like we're going to the same place." "Then keep up," Lyra said, already moving toward the next street. They moved together, covering each other's flanks as they advanced. The city was a maze of collapsed buildings, twisted metal, and burning wreckage. The smell of smoke and scorched stone was everywhere. In the distance, Jack could hear the hum of enemy drones. At one point, a sniper's shot rang out, the bolt grazing Jack's shoulder. Before he could react, Lyra had already spun around, fired a single shot, and taken the sniper down. She didn't even pause to celebrate. "Watch your left," she said, her tone as flat as ever. They reached Sector 7 and found the unit. pinned down behind an overturned transport. The enemy was pushing hard here, sending in wave after wave. Without hesitation, Jack and Lyra joined the defense. Jack threw a smoke grenade to cover the squad's position, and Lyra took the high ground, firing down on the advancing troops. After 15 minutes of non-stop fighting, the enemy began to pull back. The street was littered with bodies, weapons, and the wreckage of machines. Jack looked over at Lyra again, and this time he couldn't help himself. "You know," he said, "if we survive this war, I'm getting you a brand new set of armor. One without all the paint." Lyra gave the faintest hint of a smile. "If we survive," she said, "I'll let you try." For the first time since they met, Jack realized he wanted to see that smile again. The next morning was a quiet one, at least compared to the day before. The sky was still gray, and the city ruins were filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional distant boom of artillery. Jack sat on a cracked stone ledge, eating a cold ration bar that tasted like cardboard. Lyra stood a few meters away, checking the joints of her armor and cleaning her rifle with precise, practiced movements. Their orders had changed overnight. Instead of holding Sector 7, they were now assigned to move deeper into coalition territory to escort a supply convoy. Jack didn't mind the change. Anything that meant not sitting in one place waiting for another attack was fine with him. Lyra didn't comment at all when they were briefed. She simply nodded as if any mission was the same to her. The convoy was small, 3 armored transports carrying food, ammo, and medical supplies. They had to get it through a narrow route that ran between the edge of the city and a stretch of rocky hills. Everyone knew the enemy controlled parts of those hills, which meant an ambush was almost certain. Still, supplies were running low, and the mission had to happen. As they set out, Jack walked beside Lyra near the front of the column. "So," he said, "do you always get stuck with the dangerous jobs? Or is this just a special welcome for me?" Lyra glanced at him but didn't slow her pace. "Dangerous jobs are the only ones worth doing," she replied. "You learn more when the risk is real." Jack gave a short laugh. And here I was hoping for something easy. The path was quiet for the first half hour, the only sounds being the rumble of the transports and the crunch of boots on gravel. But Jack's instincts began to itch. The silence felt too heavy. He noticed how Lyra's eyes kept flicking toward the ridges on their right. She sensed it too. It happened fast. A sharp crack echoed through the air, followed by a flash of light as the lead transport's windshield shattered. Enemy fire poured in from the rocky slopes. Jack dove behind a boulder, returning fire, while Lyra shouted commands to the convoy crew. Her voice was calm, carrying over the chaos like she had been through this 1,000 times. Enemy troops in light armor charged down the slopes, moving quickly between rocks. Jack took down 2 of them before they could get close. Lyra moved. With the same deadly precision as before, each shot clean and controlled. They were outnumbered, but the narrow path worked in their favor, forcing the attackers to come in smaller groups. "They're trying to flank us from the left," Jack called out, spotting movement near the rear transport. "I see it," Lyra replied. Without hesitation, she sprinted across open ground, using the burning wreckage of a drone as cover, and cut down the enemy squad before they could close in. Jack covered her from a distance, taking out a soldier who had aimed at her back. After several minutes, the attackers began to retreat, leaving behind their dead and wounded. Jack stood, breathing hard, and looked over at Lyra. "You know," he said, "most people would be shaken after running straight into enemy fire like that." Lyra slung her rifle over her shoulder. "Most people don't win wars," she said. Simply, once the convoy was moving again, Jack found himself walking beside her once more. He wanted to ask about her past, about how she had become the kind of fighter who could stay so calm under fire, but something in her expression told him she wouldn't answer. Instead, he said, "You saved my life back there. That guy aiming for me? I didn't even see him." "And you covered mine," she replied. We're even. By the time they reached the coalition forward base, the sun was dipping low, painting the clouds in shades of dull orange. The convoy had taken some damage, but most of the supplies were intact. The commander at the base congratulated them both for their work. Jack noticed that even here, among her own people, Lyra didn't stay to talk. She dropped off her gear, gave a short report, and left for the barracks without waiting for praise. Later that night, Jack found her sitting alone near a small fire outside the barracks. She was working on her armor again, scraping dried blood off with a small blade. He sat down across from her, holding 2 steaming cups of whatever passed for coffee here. "Thought you might want one," he said, sliding it toward her. She took it without a word, sipping slowly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of artillery filled the silence. Finally, Jack said, "You know, I think you've got the right idea. Dangerous jobs, dangerous places, keeps you sharp." Lyra gave him a look that was almost a smile. "Or it just kills you faster." Jack grinned. "Well, if that happens, at least I'll have someone interesting watching my back." She didn't answer, but he saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward before she went back to cleaning her armor. 2 days later, the war shifted again. Reports came in that the enemy was massing troops on the eastern edge of the city. The coalition high command believed they were preparing for a decisive strike that could break through their defenses. Jack and Lyra's unit was ordered to join, a mixed squad of humans and aliens to reinforce the sector. The streets were quieter than usual as they moved out, but Jack had learned that quiet here never meant safe. He kept scanning the windows and rooftops while walking beside Lyra. She moved with the same focused calm as always, her armor still marked with the dark stains of past battles. Jack noticed that she hadn't tried to clean them off completely. Maybe she didn't want to. Their squad reached an abandoned marketplace. Broken stalls and overturned crates littered the ground. The smell of smoke was still in the air from fires that had burned days earlier. Lyra signaled for everyone to stop. "Too open," she said quietly. "If they're here, this is where they'll hit us." Jack crouched behind a stall and checked his rifle. "You think they're close?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head, listening. Then she said, "Yes." The attack came seconds later. A roar of engines and the thud of heavy boots filled the air as enemy troops burst from the far end of the marketplace. They were supported by small hovercraft with mounted weapons. Jack opened fire immediately, aiming for the gunners. Lyra moved forward, using the wreckage for cover and picking her shots with deadly accuracy. The fight was fierce. Plasma bolts burned holes in walls, and the ground shook from the impact of explosives. Jack found himself separated from the rest of the squad when one of the hovercrafts circled around to cut them off. He ducked behind a stone pillar as the vehicle's gun swept the area. Before he could move, Lyra appeared out of nowhere, vaulting over the side of the hovercraft and firing point-blank into the gunner. The vehicle spun out of control, crashing into a pile of rubble. "You always show up at the right time," Jack said as she pulled him to his feet. "Stay alive," she replied simply, before turning to rejoin the fight. After 15 minutes of chaos, the enemy began to fall back. The squad had taken losses, but they'd held the marketplace. Jack leaned against a wall, catching his breath, while Lyra stood nearby, scanning the exits for any sign of another attack. That's when he decided to ask the question that had been on his mind since they met. "Why do you fight like this?" he said. "I've seen soldiers who just want to survive, but you? It's like you're trying to burn through every enemy you meet." Lyra's eyes stayed on the street ahead. "Because I have nothing left to lose," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no hiding the weight behind it. Jack didn't speak. He had guessed something like this before, but hearing it made it real. "Family?" he asked softly. She nodded once. "Gone. My home is ash. The blood on my armor. It's theirs, and it's the enemy's. I wear both." He didn't know what to say. For once, his usual humor felt wrong. Instead, he just said, Then I guess I'll make sure you're not the one who falls." They regrouped with the rest of the squad and began moving toward the eastern line. As they got closer, the sound of fighting grew louder. The enemy had already reached parts of the defensive wall. Smoke rose into the sky, and the smell of burning metal was strong. On the wall, they joined the defense, firing down at waves of attackers. Jack stayed close to Lyra, covering her when she reloaded. She moved like a force of nature, her rifle never still for long, every shot finding its mark. Once, an enemy soldier managed to climb up and rush her from behind, but Jack caught him, with a burst before he got close. She didn't even turn, she just said, "Good," and kept shooting. The battle lasted for hours. By the time it ended, the ground beyond the wall was covered in bodies, both enemy and allied. The line had held, but it was clear this was only the beginning of something bigger. As they walked back toward the command post, Jack glanced at her. "You ever think about what happens after this war?" "No," she said without hesitation. "Wars don't end for people like me." Jack looked ahead, the sounds of the wounded filling the air. "Maybe they do," he said quietly. "You just have to survive long enough to find out." She didn't respond, but he caught the faintest flicker in her eyes, a momentary pause, in the hard, unshakable wall she carried around herself. And in that small moment, Jack decided that no matter how bad the next battle got, he'd make sure Lyra would have a chance to see whatever came after the war. 3 nights later, the eastern wall was quiet again, but no one believed it would last. Scouts reported that the enemy was massing for another strike, one that would come with heavier weapons and elite soldiers. Jack and Lyra's unit was assigned to hold a choke point at an old industrial district. It was a maze of narrow streets, rusting machinery, and half-collapsed buildings. The perfect place to make a stand or get trapped. The air smelled of oil and ash as they moved into position. Jack crouched behind a broken conveyor belt, checking his rifle for the 3rd time. Lyra was a few meters away, kneeling beside a damaged control console. She was setting up a remote detonator on a string of charges they had hidden in the rubble. "You sure this will work?" Jack asked, glancing over. She didn't look up. "It will work. The street is narrow. When they push through, the explosion will block their armor and force them to fight on foot." Jack gave a small grin. "And that's when we say hello." Lyra finally looked at him. "That's when we finish it." The first sound of the enemy came just before dawn, a low, steady rumble that made the metal walls vibrate. Jack's grip tightened. The rumble grew louder, joined by the heavy clank of armored vehicles. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Then they appeared, dark shapes moving through the smoke at the far end of the street. The enemy vehicles rolled forward, their weapons scanning for targets. Jack and Lyra waited, hidden in the shadows. The rest of their squad held their fire, letting the enemy come deeper into the trap. When the lead vehicle reached the center of the street, Lyra pressed the trigger. The ground erupted in a flash of fire and debris, the explosion echoing like thunder. Metal tore apart and the lead vehicle flipped on its side, blocking the path. The following vehicles slammed to a stop, and enemy soldiers poured out, shouting orders in their strange, harsh language. "Now," Lyra said. Jack popped out from cover, firing in quick bursts. Enemies dropped one by one, their armor no match, for his rounds at close range. Lyra moved with sharp precision, her shots clean and fast. The rest of the squad joined in, turning the narrow street into a killing zone. The enemy pushed hard, trying to climb over the wreckage and flank them. Jack spotted one slipping around the left side and shouted a warning. Lyra was already moving, sprinting across the rubble and cutting the soldier down before he could get behind their line. A plasma grenade exploded near Jack, the heat searing his arm even through the armor. He stumbled, but kept firing. Lyra glanced at him. "You're hit." "Just a scratch," he said through clenched teeth. For nearly 20 minutes, the fight raged. The enemy tried again and again to break through, but the choke point held. Finally, their remaining soldiers began to pull back, dragging the wounded with them. The street fell silent except for the hiss of smoke and the distant sound of retreating. Engines! Jack leaned against a wall, catching his breath. His arm throbbed, but he was more focused on the sight of Lyra. Her armor was darker now, streaked with fresh blood over the older stains. She looked at him, and for a second, he thought she might make a comment about surviving again. Instead, she simply said, "You fought well." "So did you," he replied, "though I'm starting to think you like collecting more paint for that armor." She gave a faint smirk. "Maybe." As they regrouped, a message came through from command. The enemy retreat wasn't a full withdrawal, it was a feint. Scouts reported that their real push was happening at a position deeper in the city, and the defenses there were already crumbling. Jack and Lyra were ordered to move immediately. They didn't waste time. Moving through the ruined streets, they passed civilians being rushed away by medics and rescue crews. The closer they got to the new battle line, the louder the sound of weapons became. Jack could hear the high-pitched whine of enemy drones overhead. When they reached the fight, it was chaos. Allied soldiers were falling back under heavy fire, and enemy troops had already breached part of the defensive wall. Without waiting for orders, Jack and Lyra charged in. Jack took the left flank, clearing out soldiers hiding behind collapsed barricades. Lyra went right, taking down a drone with a single, perfect shot. The two of them moved like they had been fighting together, or for years, covering each other without a word. When Jack ran out of ammo, Lyra tossed him a spare magazine without breaking her aim. When Lyra was cornered by 3 enemy soldiers, Jack took them out with a quick grenade toss. After an hour of brutal fighting, the wall was secured again. Jack stood beside Lyra, both of them breathing hard, sweat and grime covering their faces. The city was still burning, but for now they had stopped the enemy from breaking through. Jack looked at her, shaking his head. "You ever get tired of this?" Lyra's eyes scanned the ruined skyline. "No," she said quietly, "because if we stop, they win." Jack didn't argue. Instead, he just nodded and followed her as they moved to their next position, ready for whatever came next. The sun never truly rose the next day. Thick black smoke hung over the city, turning the sky into a permanent twilight. Jack stood on the upper floor of a shattered building, staring out at the horizon. In the distance, flashes of light marked where the enemy was already pressing, into another sector. It was the biggest assault yet, and the coalition lines were stretched thin. Lyra joined him, her rifle slung across her back. Her armor was dented, scarred, and darkened with old and new stains. She didn't speak right away, just stood beside him, scanning the battlefield. "Command says this is it," Jack said. "If they break through here, the rest of the city is gone." Lyra's voice was calm, steady. "Then we hold, no matter what." They moved to their assigned position, a choke point near an old bridge crossing. If the enemy got across, they could hit the command center from behind. Jack and Lyra were placed with a small team of humans and aliens, all of them grim-faced. As the minutes passed, the air filled with the low hum of engines and the distant metallic roar of the enemy's approach. Jack checked his rifle again. Lyra crouched beside a crate of ammunition, loading extra magazines with mechanical precision. "You ready?" Jack asked. "Always," she replied. The first wave came fast. Dozens of soldiers in heavy armor, supported by drones that hovered overhead. Jack fired in short, controlled bursts, taking down 2 drones before they could drop explosives. Lyra's shots were sharper, cleaner. Every pull of the trigger dropped an enemy soldier, but more kept coming. The air turned thick with smoke and the whine of plasma bolts. Explosions shook the ground, and the bridge's cracked pavement began to crumble under the weight of battle. "Left side!" Jack shouted as a squad tried to push around their flank. Lyra was already moving, sprinting through falling debris to cut them off. She fought like a storm, her rifle a constant rhythm of fire and reload. Jack covered her from a distance, but even then he could see she was pushing herself harder than ever before. A sudden blast tore through the defenses, sending 2 coalition soldiers to the ground. The enemy pushed into the gap, and for a moment, it looked like the line would break. Jack ran forward, diving behind a wrecked vehicle and firing into the oncoming troops. Lyra appeared beside him, sliding into cover and tossing him a spare magazine. "Don't die," she said simply. "I'll try not to," Jack replied with a grin, even as his heart pounded. The fighting dragged on for what felt like hours. Every time they pushed the enemy back, another wave came. The ground was littered with wreckage and bodies. The smell of burning metal and scorched stone filled the air. Then the worst happened. One of the enemy's massive armored walkers appeared, on the far side of the bridge, its heavy cannons tearing through cover. Jack knew their rifles wouldn't do much against it. "We need heavy firepower," he yelled into his comm. "Reinforcements are too far," Command replied. "You'll have to hold until they arrive." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "We don't." "Hold! We destroy it!" Before Jack could stop her, she was already moving toward the walker, weaving between debris to avoid its weapons. Jack swore under his breath and followed, firing at enemy soldiers trying to stop her. They reached a half-collapsed support beam that led up toward the bridge's upper structure. Lyra climbed quickly, planting small explosive charges along the way. Jack covered her, taking out anyone who got too close. "Charges set," she called. "When it's under us, we blow it." The walker clanked forward, massive and slow. Jack felt the vibration through the cracked concrete beneath his boots. Lyra waited until it was directly below them, then triggered the detonator. The explosion ripped through the support beam, dropping several tons of steel and debris onto the walker's head. Its cannons went silent as it crashed to the ground, in a cloud of dust and fire. The enemy advance faltered, their morale shaken. Jack and Lyra jumped down, landing hard but still moving. "Remind me never to argue with you about plans," Jack said, his voice breathless. "Good," Lyra replied, reloading her rifle. "Arguing wastes time." With the walker destroyed, the coalition forces rallied. They pushed the enemy back, across the bridge, forcing them to retreat. The ground was scorched and the smell of burning still hung in the air, but the choke point had held. As they stood catching their breath, Jack looked at her armor again. It was darker than ever now, streaked with fresh battle marks. "You're going to need a whole new set of paint after today," he said. Lyra gave the faintest smile. "I told you, it's mostly enemy." For a moment, even with the smoke and fire around them, Jack felt something close to hope. If they could survive this, maybe they could survive anything. After the long fight, the city slowly began to heal. But Jack and Lyra knew peace was fragile. They were sent on a new mission, this time to scout enemy territory deep beyond the front lines. The goal was to find out if the enemy was regrouping or planning another attack. They traveled through shattered landscapes where forests once grew, but now only ash and broken trees remained. The air was thick and heavy, and silence surrounded them like a cloak. Jack and Lyra moved carefully, every step alert for danger. As they reached the edge of an enemy encampment, Jack whispered, "This place feels different, quieter." Lyra nodded. "They're hiding something. I can feel it." Using the cover of night, they crept closer. The camp was large, filled with rows of tents and armored vehicles. But what caught their eyes was the large ship docked at the center, a warship unlike any they had seen before. It was sleek, dark, and pulsing with energy. Jack frowned. "That ship. It looks faster, stronger. If they launch that, we're in real trouble." Lyra scanned the perimeter. "We need to report this, but first we must get closer and see what weapons it carries." They slipped through shadows, inching nearer to the ship. As they studied it, enemy guards suddenly appeared, shouting alarms. Jack and Lyra had no choice but to fight their way out. Bullets flew, plasma bolts hissed, and explosions lit the dark sky. They ran toward the forest's edge, with enemies close behind. Lyra covered Jack as he fired, dropping attackers one by one. Finally, they reached a clearing and disappeared into the trees. Panting, Jack said, "That was too close. But we have what we came for." Lyra nodded, eyes sharp in the moonlight. "The war isn't over. It's about to get worse." They made their way back to coalition lines, their message urgent. Commanders listened carefully as Jack and Lyra described the new enemy warship. "We need a plan," Jack said. "This changes everything," Lyra added. "We fight smarter, harder, together." Days later, as preparations began for the next battle, Jack looked at Lyra. Her armor was still scarred, but her eyes burned with determination. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it as one." She smiled softly. "And this time, we'll make sure the enemy's paint job is all over their own armor." Jack laughed quietly. "Yeah, mostly enemy, right?" They shared a brief moment of quiet, knowing their fight was far from over, but that together they had a chance.